Anne-Marie Madden, welcome to the Single Track Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And we will go way in depth on this soon, but congrats on the golden ticket at the Black Canyon 100K this past weekend. Do you have any initial thoughts and feelings?
Well, thank you. Mostly, I'm just super grateful and kind of enjoying the week of reminiscing and and remembering and processing. So, yeah, I'm sure we'll go through the race later, but overall, I'm just pretty ecstatic, and I couldn't have asked for more, really.
Very cool. Well, I was just scrolling through Ultra Sign Up like just before this call started, and you have had this really long, successful career, at least through the 2010s in the Pacific Northwest scene. And you've podiumed at some of the most important races in our sport. And so, at least in my mind, this golden ticket at Black Canyon, it doesn't surprise me at all. It probably doesn't surprise a lot of people in the community. But I don't know much about you beyond that. And I'm curious if we can just do a little bit on your background before the race analysis. And yeah, how did you get into the sport of ultra running?
So I would say it all began more with just trail running and not necessarily the ultra definition. So I'm sure I've mentioned it somewhere else in the past, but when I was 13 or 14, begged my parents for a dog, and finally we got a husky from the SPCA, and I just started running with her in the trails, and that just soon became kind of my favorite thing to do. And I've roved through some other sports like triathlon along the way, but always came back to running, and specifically kind of trail running as my first love. And then beyond, I guess we define ultra marathon as anything longer than a marathon. So I don't think until 2013 or 2014 did I run more than a marathon, and it would have been in Canada. It was a Trail Stoke race in Revelstoke, which is a pretty stunning part of BC. If ever you get the chance to visit, I highly recommend it. And that was our Canadian National Championships that year, and I think it was supposed to be more than a 50K. But we had really bad weather up on the ridge. So the day before, they kind of notified us that the course might have to be shortened. So it worked out to about 55, I think. And yeah, that was kind of the beginning of ultra racing. And considering, that probably was about 10 years or maybe a little short of 10 years ago, I've clearly taken my time to step it up to the 100-mile distance. Maybe the opposite of most people who kind of progress pretty rapidly from 50K, 50-mile, 100K, 100 miles. I've been very gradual in my escalation of distance.
And was that calculated all along? Like, have you had this like 10 to 15 year plan mapped out, or were you just pursuing races that spoke to you and distance was irrelevant?
Yeah, I think I'm sort of very kind of intuitive in terms of I guess my choice of races are often sort of serendipitous and just whatever feels right at the time. So by no means was this a calculated 10-year plan. And definitely had I raced a 50 miler that had a golden ticket and I won one 5 years ago, I probably would have gone, but that just sort of never really materialized. But I probably am a sort of cautious person by nature in terms of gauging my own ability. So I'm not someone that came into the sport with the full confidence that running 100 miles would be super easy. And just because I have a reasonable half marathon PR, I could definitely just crush 100 miles without any issues. So I've needed a bit of time to kind of warm up to the idea, and also I think have benchmark tests of my capabilities to give me the confidence to go further.
You mentioned this default cautiousness in life, which is fascinating. And I'm curious, you mentioned that also you've been trail running for a while now, dating back to childhood. What was the initial inspiration to get into the ultra scene? Like, what inspired you to make that jump?
I guess it's just the curiosity of what's possible and what you can do. And um, I love being outside and in nature and sort of pushing myself and being in that space on a good day when you're lucky and you kind of enter that flow state where you're kind of achieving uh, a sense of floating through the trails. When you have one of those good days, you're like, why wouldn't I want to do this for longer? And then you have a bad race and you think, I'm never doing this again. So it waxes and wanes, but despite being cautious, maybe I am always also at the same time striving for bigger challenges. So wanting to push out of my comfort zone, but in slow increments or something like that.
Which is interesting. Like you said, there's just so many people in our sport that have probably influenced generations of runners to graduate to these bigger distances in a very short amount of time. Like I know, for example, myself, I went to the 100-mile distance 2 years into the sport, definitely was not ready, but I had just looked to the people that, inspired me in the first place. I'm like, well, they did that path, so I'm taking it too. So yeah, kudos to you on the ability to go at it in your own time frame and to cover everything else before in the lead up. Are you based in, is it Vancouver or which
Yeah,
where?
yeah,
Vancouver. Okay.
yeah,
I'm also
Vancouver, Canada, not
Canada.
Washington, just to specify. There's
That's
two
right.
Vancouvers.
So a lot of people have told me that Vancouver is the greatest city on earth for a lot of reasons. Whether you're a skier, a trail runner, you're also by the ocean. What makes it a great place to live and train? Is there a cool scene up there? Maybe talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably one of the only cities in Canada where I'd be excited to live because you can both be, if you're into academia or you have a profession that requires you to be in a city, you can also escape to the trails in 20 minutes and be, lost within another 30 minutes of climbing. So we're very lucky in that we have this proximity to nature. And as you said, both the ocean, mountains, alpine skiing, and because it's a temperate climate, we're near the ocean. At low elevation throughout the year, you can pretty much always find some trail that's not covered in snow. Don't get me wrong, I've trained for both Tarawera and now this race, that are both February races through our kind of winter. And getting in the vert can be challenging, and without a doubt, you end up running through a lot of snow. But we have amazing geography and landscape, and then layered on top of that, I think this part of the world has attracted a lot of people that are willing to put up with the horrendous cost of living and the challenges that come with living in sort of one of these world-renowned cities because they prioritize access to nature, sports, and life outside of kind of work. So we have a great running community and especially like a trail community. And there's, certain key figures out here. Many people will know Gary Robbins, but there's also like Solana Klassen. There's a few excellent race directors that put on fantastic series. And through those, they, grow a community of people that encourage each other, that share their knowledge. And they've also been really inclusive in their race distances. So almost any event you can go to, there'll be something from like a 13K to a 50 miler, or, not always that big of a spread, but there's usually multiple distances, which makes it accessible for people that want to start trail running and don't necessarily quite yet know if they can tackle a really long distance, so they can kind of get their feet wet with shorter distance races. And it also offers opportunities, if I'm planning to go to an international or a US race in 2 or 3 months' time, I can still go to some of these local races, and maybe it won't, I'm not going to taper, and I'll use that shorter race as like a tempo for the day and maybe add on some distance before and after. But you can kind of stay connected with your community and the people and get an excellent kind of workout and some competition. And yeah, it's a really great place to live and train for sure.
Yeah, I've never been. I'm based in Salt Lake City, Utah, so I can definitely appreciate your comments about access to the mountains. But Vancouver's got the body of water too, and
Yeah.
we don't, and we have the Great Salt Lake, but you can't really recreate in it. So very cool. What do you do for work?
I work in Vancouver as an anesthesiologist, and about 80% of the cases I work on are cardiac, so kind of cardiac surgery or in the cardiac surgery ICU.
And one thing I'm curious about, given that you're definitely one of the better runners in our sport, how do you balance the work with your time training as a runner? Does either get in the way?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot. So without a doubt, since I started medical school and even in my undergrad, school and work has always had to be the priority. And especially now, like just the responsibility and the importance of what I do with my job, I have to have that take precedence. But now I'm starting to learn about how to carve out some time or, not not necessarily I have to make like the knowledge and when I'm at work 100% of my focus, but I don't necessarily have to, work 100-hour weeks all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to learn balancing some of the hours. And we have quite a supportive department. I think everyone's trying to make sure that they can still see their families and achieve some sense of balance, which is always a challenging concept. Um, but on the day to day kind of basis, I am a morning person, but this job is also a morning person's job. So you start at 7 in the morning at work. So to get your training in, before 7, I get up pretty early and try to do it in the mornings most of the time for two reasons. One, at the end of the day, after standing on your legs for 12 or 14 hours, like they tend not to be super responsive or workouts don't go quite as well in the evening. And also our end times are not defined or clear cut. So it's not like I know I'm getting off work at 7 p.m. So, the times that I have left it to the evening, you're there at 7 and you realize, oh, we're still going to be here till 8. Oh, it's 9, it's 9:30, it's 10. Okay, I'm just going to go home and go to bed when we're done. So I find it's more reliable to get it done in the mornings.
And is Solomon your sponsor?
Yeah, Solomon, I guess they're North America now. I used to say Canada, but I think we've kind of merged a bit. So yeah, Solomon Canada or Solomon North America.
Well, one thing I'm curious about, again, given that you're one of the better runners in our sport, have you ever had to face the decision to choose between running and your job in medicine? Like, has a brand like Solomon ever said, we would love to just give you the opportunity to run full time? Like, we'll give you a salary that makes it so that you can leave whatever other work you're doing and you can focus on this full time. Has that ever been an option for you, and would you consider it?
Um, I've never been explicitly told that. So, and I've certainly never asked. I'm not totally sure that I would. I've seen it time again. Like I'm very grateful for the balance I have, and I feel so lucky to feel like I am able to run and work. Um, and there's a certain element of it takes the pressure off a little bit when it's like if I do badly at a race on Saturday, I fly home on Sunday. By Monday, I'm just taking care of patients and no one really cares or worries about it. And you're just too busy to get too hung up on how something went poorly.
Yeah.
And I know that a lot of the professional athletes, like it's a lot of pressure. And
Yeah.
if things aren't going well or you get an injury, there's certainly a huge sense of like searching for purpose. So I'd be lying if I didn't say that sometimes I dream about what my life would be like if all I was doing with most of my day was training or recovering or doing the kind of extra stuff that you should be doing outside of just running. But I've certainly never been kind of brave enough to kind of pull the trigger, ask to take a sabbatical, or kind of do anything like that.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, it's a question that I ask almost every guest that comes on the show because, and I'm sure you have similar thoughts when it comes to like thinking about medicine and bringing it into sports and running. I have a business background and I really can't stop thinking about it, even when I'm in the running world. And so I'm always curious about ways that people could make it in the sport if that's what they wanted to do. So that's cool. Um, Maybe we can talk about Black Canyon now. Was
Sure.
First of all, I'm curious what drew you to the Black Canyon 100, given that there's a whole list of other golden ticket races that you could have signed up for.
So, well, with like kind of my work and the department we work in, just to make all people's vacation requests fit into this massive spreadsheet. More than a year out, we're picking our holiday for the following kind of year, year and a half. So at the time, I took that weekend and a few days preceding off with the idea that I would go back to New Zealand and run Tarawera and for the second time. And my husband Hamish has a lot of extended family there, so we do like to go visit New Zealand. And of course, with COVID and everything, it became fairly clear last fall that New Zealand was not going to be open for travel. And at that time, I knew Tarawera was definitely a golden ticket race. And so it kind of just magically worked out that Black Canyons happened to be on the same weekend and had golden tickets. So that was perfect because I didn't have to change any of my time off. And it would have been like the same weekend in terms of your training and your lead up and your taper. But even then, Omicron kind of arrived. So I was training for it, but I hadn't registered or bought flights or sorted out places to stay or kind of made any of the arrangements till maybe 2 weeks before. So that's kind of how that came about. And one other thing I will say was that although I definitely wanted a golden ticket, I made sure I looked at the race and thought to myself, if this wasn't a golden ticket race, or if you show up and there's just a phenomenal field of women and you don't get a ticket, is this 100 kilometers a 100-kilometer course that you're excited to run, that you want to experience and that you want to see? And 100%, it just looked beautiful and the landscape was amazing and such a stark contrast to where I live right now and training through the winter. So there was just so much about it that pulled me there, and it kind of all fit. It just all seemed right, and all these pieces kind of started falling into place. And then we found out Tarawera was canceled, and we even got that an extra ticket was brought to Black Canyons, and it was just like, okay, this is meant to be.
Still, though, the flexibility of your situation, I think, makes this golden ticket even more impressive. And I'm curious because I'm not as familiar with the Tarawera course. Is that course similar at all in terms of like elevation profile, course profile to Black Canyon? And was the training that you did in the lead up to this sufficient to be successful at Black Canyon?
Yeah, I mean, having run both now, obviously I'd only run Tarawera when I was doing the training. It felt like there's more climbing at Tarawera, and it's not really a point to point. Maybe it sort of is a point to point, but in terms of the elevation profile, you're not kind of experiencing that net elevation loss that we have at Black Canyons. But essentially for me, the net downhill, I think I felt ready for that, and both of them would have been the same temperature. And to be honest, it was the weather that was the biggest kind of, I don't know if you want to call it concern, or the biggest challenge in my mind.
The heat.
And they were going to be fairly similar, maybe the same temperature, although Tarawera would have been far more humid.
Okay. Wow. And I think you mentioned it already, but going in, the golden ticket was the objective, and you decided that this was the year that you'd go for Western States and you'd test out that 100-mile distance.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been thinking about it for 2 or 3 years, but with kind of the way COVID worked out, it just wasn't really possible. I'd put my name in the lottery, but never got drawn. So yeah, it became apparent if I'm going to go, it'll have to be through a golden ticket means.
Let's talk about execution a bit. I'm curious to get some insight on what the race itself looked like. did you have a particular strategy going in? Were you attempting to, for example, lead from start to finish, or were you expecting to go out slower and pick off people in the second half?
Uh, it was the kind of plan was just to go out at whatever pace just seemed right for my legs. And if that meant what I was in the first place, I would have been a little bit weirded out by it, but I think I would have still just run at whatever seemed right. But I knew that it'd be very unlikely that what felt good and sustainable for me would land you in the top position, because there's always someone that's very excited to go out fast. And yeah, it ended up being kind of Dominica, who I didn't know until last weekend,
Yeah.
who went out quite fast, and then Addie was second, and then there was a huge group of us, and I want to say like third through 10th were within 5 seconds of each other, so your placing didn't really matter so much within that large group of people because we were all so close essentially. But it felt reassuring that it was definitely, in my mind, a sustainable pace. I was feeling very good, and I was just very grateful. Every race you start in the first few kilometers, or at least I'm sort of doing this like body scan, like, hey, how are the feet achy today or not? Or how do the quads feel? Or how does the energy feel? How's my stomach doing? And kind of like, as I was sort of like scanning myself and running and getting a feel and looking at my watch and going like, what actual pace is this generating, this amount of effort? I was like, I think this will be a good day. Or like, that like certainly that there's nothing coming out the gates that seems to be going wrong. Whereas I'd say my last couple races, neither felt especially good. So this was a stark change for how it felt starting out. I was very grateful for that.
I'm curious there, is how you feel in those first few miles typically a good forecast for how the race is going to end up? Or have you had races in the past where you've done that scan, things aren't feeling great, but you've still managed to sort of overcome it and put together a result that you're satisfied with?
Yeah, I have had races where I've sort of overcome it. Probably the only one that I haven't is if my stomach feels really off from the get-go. I've rarely ever recovered from that. But I'm trying to think. Yeah, most of the time it is a fairly good predictor of how things will go. It's not very often I feel quite bad and then things kind of loosen up. The only time I can think where I felt like absolutely terrible was way too cool, 2019.
Okay.
And I have an old neck injury that 90% of the time is like I don't even feel it whatsoever, and every once in a while it just locks up. And at the start of the race, I was like completely immobile up through my thoracic and cervical spine, and it was just like it was horribly painful for the first half of the race, and then things just kind of settled out. And I think I was, in eighth or something, and then climbed through the field to finish in third. And that was probably the only race where I thought I might drop out of this at 5K, and then felt very happy with how it went overall.
Are you someone that likes to share a lot of miles and sort of share energy with other runners throughout the race? Or do you like to sort of be in your own head and, running your own race from start to finish?
I very much enjoy running with other people at times, but I won't change my pace to make it happen. So if my pace is means that I'm in the middle of a group of people, then that's great, because I do feel like it's a nice distractor and time passes faster and it's enjoyable to share. But if everyone picks it up and it just doesn't seem like that's right for me, then I will happily let people go. It really doesn't stress me out in the moment. Which is maybe like, I sometimes hear people, I will say more likely men, talking about how you'll like never want to fall off the back of the pack, or if you do that, you'll never catch up. And so maybe it's my lack of ever like a formal track background or stuff where there's a lot of maybe importance to how you position yourself in packs, and it really makes the difference. But I never kind of had that background, so it never really got drilled into me that to be super calculated about your positioning.
Especially, I'm curious, in the second half of the race, were you always in one of those top 3 to 5 spots, or were you working off of the back of the pack? Mostly, I'm just curious to know, like, what was a golden ticket? Were you always in a golden ticket position from start to finish?
I guess not at the start, because there were probably times where how I crossed the time you met would have been like 9th or 10th, but we were all clustered together. And then, sorry, I think in kilometers, but I know Black Canyon City would be 60K, and probably around 50 kilometers, we went through an aid station, a group of us, 4 of us, and we'd already kind of dropped 2 or 3 people from the pack on a climb. And just going through the aid station, it sort of fragmented. Claire went out first, and then I think Addie, and then me, and I must have passed Addie. But by the time I got into Black Canyon City and I knew that I was a couple minutes behind Claire, I had no idea how far behind Dominica I was. And I only knew once I was then leaving, I could see that maybe it was like 2, 4, 6, 10, like every couple minutes behind me, there was probably another female. But at that stage, I was like, oh, I guess I'm third. So at the time, I didn't know Claire wouldn't take her ticket. So in my mind, I had the last golden ticket spot kind of from Black Canyon City to the finish.
One other question, because you mentioned something interesting a minute ago, and that is, if you're in a group, that's great, but you're not going to conform to the pace to stay with it. You're going to continue to run your own race. I'm curious, given that you had this objective going in to secure a golden ticket, how did you cope with that pressure throughout the race? Were you thinking, well, I'm going to run my own race, and if it happens to fall on my lap, great. Or were you thinking, like, I have this objective and I'm going to take some risks at various points in the race to hopefully put myself in the best position as possible? Because it's interesting to me that you're very self-assured in your pacing and how you feel from start to finish. And a lot of people will get caught up in like the theatrics of the race and want to follow people that they think are going to do something similar.
Well, I guess it just worked out that I didn't have to stress out about it, but it could have been different. I kind of felt like until 60K, any major risks are probably just going to land me in a world of hurt or trouble later on. And even races where I've paced very comfortably, like in 2019, I did North Face, the 50 miler, and ended up finishing second only because I passed Addie Bracey in, the last 5 miles. But I was running at what I thought was perfectly sustainable pace. And then coming up from Muir Beach, all my quads, like every muscle in my lower body seized all at once. And I was sort of just stuck standing there trying not to fall over for maybe 30 or 45 seconds. And I thought to myself, like, oh man, this might be the end of my race. Like I might just get stuck here. And at the time I was in third and feeling good. And so I think I'm very aware that taking risks can, like, in an instant, your whole race can completely fall apart if you take too many risks, or at least me personally, because my stomach will go or my muscles will just seize and like prevent me from moving forward. So I guess I was in third. And when I was at the turnaround, I sort of, every time I'd look back, there was no one and I was catching some men. So I sort of thought, this feels sustainable. I'm going to keep going. If I turn around and I see there's a female catching up to me, like I will say I had another gear that I could have accessed, but I know that pushing it would have come at the risk of starting to throw up, overheating for sure, or having like really bad muscle cramping. So I decided to stay under that line as long as I was still in third, but willing to kind of take the risk if at 85 kilometers there was now a woman a minute back. I sort of been like, well, you're going to have to take the risk at this stage because, you're close to the finish. And if you don't take it for sure, they've obviously started to catch up to you. So But I wouldn't have been really willing to take many risks till the last 20K or something like that.
Very cool. Well, let's talk maybe about the finish of the race. You obviously secured the golden ticket to Western States. You're going to be heading there in June. It is going to be your first 100-miler. I know we're only 4 or 5 days removed, but are you starting to think about what training will look like and what you may do to put yourself in a position to be successful there?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I need to make sure that I recover well from this race. I did Squamish 50 in October, and then on a whim ran a marathon in December, and kind of then ran this. So I usually would take December as my like break, but because of COVID and because I didn't really feel like I'd raced for much of a year till the fall, things are kind of in a different pattern right now. And then I think for me personally, I'm going to have to do as much as possible to get prepared for the heat. So probably a ton of layering, maybe some sauna, and then working on just like conditioning the quads and making sure that they can sustain 100 kilometers of running or 100 miles of running.
Do you have any competitive expectations for the race or goals?
No, I feel like top 20 is the new top 10. It's going to be unbelievably deep. And so like, obviously I'd be completely lying if I didn't like sometimes daydream on a long run about, being on the podium or doing well at Western States, but all that has to start with just running a smart race for your capabilities on the day and executing well. And then wherever your best race lands you in the rest of the women's field, it is what it is, right? So you do the best preparation you can and then run a smart race. And I think the rest is kind of out of your control, I guess, in my mind anyways.
What is exciting you most about our sport as a whole right now? Like as a fan of the sport, what's really getting you stoked these days?
Well, I would say two things. One would be I feel like we have made a lot of progress, and thanks to a lot of champions with, prominent voices and platforms out there in terms of making female participation more prominent. And then I think layering on top of that, we've also come to the recognition that it's not a very diverse sport in terms of, not just gender, but also in terms of economic background and numerous other factors that kind of allow people to find our sport. I'd say the problem there is we've become also a more professional sport, which is wonderful in terms of exposure and, like a lot of people like yourself, we have such a wonderful host of podcasts, and there's more exposure for bigger races, but I worry that comes at the cost of the consumer in terms of we want our sport to be more inclusive, but it's also becoming more professional, which somehow equates to being more expensive. So in certain ways, we're making huge gains. And then in other ways, though, cognitively, we want to make it more inclusive and also more accessible and more prominent. But then certain factors there are making it less accessible. I don't know if that makes sense, but
that makes a ton of sense. And I think about this a lot too, because those are two major goals in my own life as well. And one thing I think about, especially on the diversity front, is how much of a problem is it due to the fact that like a lot of these trail running towns like Salt Lake City and Flagstaff and Boulder, just like if I look at the demographics of those places, they're predominantly white, for example. And how do we bring this sport beyond just those towns and cities, for example, to get more folks in?
It's really challenging because a lot of our major cities have no access to good trail networks or they don't allow people to get to trails unless what they own a car. They have days off a week, like to work, and then get enough time to go drive hours to, the nearest trail network or mountain. And so you start to think about those, and you're now excluding people who can't afford a vehicle, can't afford gas, have to take care of their children, have to work 2 jobs and get no days off. So as a sport, usually just running is one of the easiest. You can put your runners on and run from your front door, but then trail running is different because you need access to trails. And part of that, perhaps we could normalize the idea that you don't have to run 7 days a week on trails. Like, you can do a lot of preparation for the sport in an urban environment.
Yes.
And even prior to me I now have a dog, and I try and maximize my running kilometers as much with him, so he gets to do as much of the volume I'm doing. So I do try to go to the trails, at like 5 a.m. near our house. But before we had him, most of my weekday running was all commuting to work, which was mostly pavement. And I, maximize the hours of my day, but by having no driving or public transport commute, and just using my running as a way to get to work and do like extra loops or a workout. But ideally, if you're going to do a race with a whole lot of vert, it'd be good if 1 or 2 of the days of the week you do find a way to get out there and season your quads. But I know that I've heard people, not because of an economic disparity, that are talking about training for a race with a larger vert, but just because they don't live somewhere with it. I know there's people who talk about finding overpasses or stairwells, or like get creative. But I think, we veered away a little bit there, but I think there's both giving people the tools to train for trail running when they don't necessarily have easy access to it. And then also maybe we need to do more things like, you look at people like Max King with his camps, or Dakota Jones and Footprints Running, like they're finding ways to open up doors for youth that might never have even known about this or have the means to start running. And if you take someone and show them how amazing it is, and then they go back to their community and even influence one other person or two, like it's kind of, there's a ripple effect from each person that we teach about this sport.
I love everything you said there, and especially what you said about normalizing non-trail running training to bring more folks in, like to show that it's not necessarily a barrier if you're not within like an hour of the mountains, for example. I'll say, like I mentioned, I live in Salt Lake City, and I have a ton of friends who, they would say that, if you're not doing the most aesthetic verty mountain runs, are you really a trail runner? But this is one of the ways we can get more folks in. And I also wish we had my brother on the call, because he's like an urban planning enthusiast. And I had all these thoughts go through my head of like reimagining travel through cities and suburbs. Like you could encourage more participants in fixing bike paths and sidewalks and trail systems, and getting rid of highways and all this stuff. And anyways, you just made me think about a ton of different cool stuff. And
no, it's funny you said that, because I thought the same thing. If we're more careful about how we build our cities, there should be more opportunity to access nature within the city, and not just assume that the city is going to be a concrete circle with a radius, and it's not until you're 20 kilometers out of it that you get to see nature. We need to find ways to bring it through our cities. And other things too. I think cycling to work has become, at least in Vancouver, something that our city is striving to make more safe and possible, having bike lanes where people feel they're protected from car traffic, and for those people who are worried about riding in the dark and the rain, they have safer routes to get to work. But also, each workplace, in my opinion, should be having full change rooms, lockers, showers, and just make it a piece of cake for your employees to walk into the building, and however they got there or whatever they did on the way, if they're covered in sweat, they have somewhere to get, clean, dry, and ready for work in 10 minutes, and not to have to join a really expensive gym next to the building just so that they have access to showers or somewhere to store their stuff. So, there's a lot within our whole culture we could be doing to just this is just making people more active in general, whether not necessarily trail running, but I think any form of movement is, it's just so good for the body and the soul.
I had no idea we were going to talk about urban design, but this has got me like so stoked. My brother gave me this book. It's called A Happy City: Transforming Our Lives Through Urban Design by Charles Montgomery. It's fantastic. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it.
I have not. Okay,
and then
thank you.
There's another book, which I've referenced on the pod before. It's called A Philosophy of Regional Planning by Benton Mackay, who's the founder or the creator of the Appalachian Trail. And,
oh, wow.
And he had this whole idea that like all of this city building was people were going to recognize it as like a net bad, and they'd go off into the wilderness. And he wanted to basically use the AT as this like spiritual center for all of society. Anyways, 2 good books that I highly recommend, but thanks for bringing this up because I think it's cool. And it has a huge connection to our sport.
Yeah. And as probably a lot of the people who love our sport do live in cities. So if each one of us kind of rattles the cage and demands for some of these things from our cities, our employers, then hopefully we can make a change.
Is there anything you used to believe strongly, whether it was in the trail running world, ultra running world, or outside of it, that you have recently changed your mind about in the last couple of years? And if so, why?
When I think about it now, a certain theme that like this year I've kind of come around to, which I'm not a huge New Year's resolution person, but there's certain things that we work very hard at that are, it's a challenge, but you want to do it and you want to go through the hardship of training or learning a new skill, art, sport, whatever it is. And I've decided that when I look at sort of my life and where I'm going to put my energy, there's certain things that I felt this ever-present guilt for not doing well or not choosing to put my time in. One would be music. Like since I was a kid, I've always wanted to be an amazing pianist. And it's like, even during COVID, I borrowed a piano, electric piano from a friend and was like practicing again and all this stuff. And I just realized I don't think there are certain things that I will put my energy into, and I think I can achieve that, the dream or whatever it is. And then there's other ones where it was like, despite me really wanting this end goal, I really didn't like the process of learning. And I got so frustrated with not being good at it that I've only now just decided you're allowed to it's not excel, but you're allowed to sort of pick and choose where you want to suffer or not.
Yeah.
And we only have so much time. And so I I just sort of let go of that dream a little bit. It was like, it's okay that you're just never going to be any good at piano. You can still listen to it and appreciate it, but you can only put so much like sweat and blood into so many things, because if you spread yourself too thin, nothing's really going to come to fruition in any of those. So I've kind of given myself permission to just either be bad or stop trying at certain things, and just that's okay.
That's a great answer. Okay, next question. I'm going to ask for a prediction here. What is one thing that you think will be drastically different about our sport by 2030?
Oh, this might be a sad thing. I worry that our natural environment is going to potentially continue to sort of decay and feel the effects of human development. And I hope that's not the case. I hope climate change doesn't continue to escalate. But I do worry. I do look into the future and question whether where we are now is going to be drastically different than what it looks like to be on this planet in 30 years. And hopefully that's not the case, but it's certainly a concern.
And just to like put that into event terms, for example, does that mean like a race like Western states might not exist because that area of the country is like constantly on fire?
Yeah, exactly. That type of thing. Yeah.
What's the biggest difference between the sport today versus our sport 10 years ago when you first came in your opinion?
I think it's a lot less grassroots. Um, and and maybe that's not the case. It's just that where I'm racing, I've been picking more major events. So, perhaps that's a difference in just where I'm racing.
Mm,
Um, but it feels more professional, more organized, and the whole world of social media has changed um, the landscape of athletes, professional athletes, in terms of their accessibility and their visibility, both in good ways and bad ways. Like, I think 10, 15 years ago, it was you had to put a lot of effort. Like, people would have to make their blog and, they'd have to update it. And if you were really interested in a certain athlete, how their race was doing, you'd have to like refresh their blog and see if they'd posted about their most recent big event. Whereas now everything is so instantaneous. It's, we've got live stream, we've got, certain things like Instagram or Strava. It's very little effort for you. There's very little barriers to just uploading that or
mm,
taking a photo and putting a quick comment. And so in some ways that's great, because I think it means more people can share their message and more people can find someone they identify with and that
yeah.
they want to be inspired by. But it also makes for a lot of noise too. And I personally am always constantly trying to cap how much time I spend on social media, not because I don't want to know about how other people are doing or what have you, but I have to be careful to, not spend too much time just sort of staring at the screen, rather be more present in the environment that you're in.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I just came across, I follow Claire Gallagher, like her website, and she has a great blog. And she just had a post about basically exiting social media. Like she's deleted
Oh,
her,
really?
I mean, she's kept it, but she's deleted all the
Okay.
posts on her Instagram and she's no longer checking in on it. And for various reasons. And I mean, it's definitely had like a long-term effect on my thinking because I mean, I'll tell you right now, like even just earlier today, I was like fantasizing about turning in my smartphone for like a flip phone that didn't have any texting ability because I think social media is a net good, but it has like destroyed the quality of my attention. Like I can't do anything for more than like 30 minutes now without checking that and getting that dopamine hit. So I'm currently pessimistic. I've usually been a social media optimist, but I'm currently feeling pessimistic.
Yeah. I mean, I think having spent a lot of my life studying, far too much of my life studying, as you know, that act of reading a textbook and staying engaged and staying focused is like, it's hard work. It's really, really hard work.
It is.
And I often hear people say like, oh, and I've said it myself, like, oh, I have a bad memory because I have to read things 5 times, or I get so distracted easily. And I've come to realize like, no, that's 90% of humans. Like almost all of us are easily distractible. And for us to learn, we need a lot of repetition. And I do not know how our youth are getting through elementary school and high school and university with a smartphone. Like
I agree.
I don't know how I concentrated for all those hours and tuned it out. And even when in my later, it was only till about 2 or 3 years ago that I was still studying for cardiac exams or whatever, I'd have to sometimes just take my phone, put it in an entirely different room. And I have all notifications except for phone calls and texts muted on my phone. So,
Mm,
if someone, like, none of my other apps, well, maybe my calendar, but other than that, I get zero notifications. And even just that the beast of the phone like calls to you sometimes, and it's like it's very dangerous. And yeah, sometimes you think you need a safe to lock it in,
Yeah.
we don't have kids, but I often think like, how would I navigate this if I had a kid right now and you're trying to explain to them how to study and how to not just pick up the phone. And I find myself doing it like at work. I'll be walking up, I don't know, to the cafeteria to get food, and it's like I'm in the stairwell and I just, without even knowing it, will like pull my phone out and
Yeah.
just, I don't know, open an app. And I'm like, what am I doing? I'm like walking. I shouldn't be. I'm gonna like bang into someone, and I've got my head down and stuff to say like, no, put it away. It just becomes this reflex, and yeah, I think it's a dangerous thing, and it's hard. It's hard to curb the impulse to just pull it out and check or look or what have you.
The scariest thing in my mind is when you do break free from it for a second, like in public. Like I was in the grocery store last night and I looked up, I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna like observe and just be present in the moment. And I looked up and I looked around me, and everybody standing in line was checking their phones, and I felt like I was in like a totally different world.
I know
It was kind of scary.
it
Um,
is really scary. It is. And one of my one of the things that happened with COVID too is, say, you go to a restaurant, and that was one place where I felt like if I was at a dinner with someone, unless I was on call and had to have my phone or something, it was very like, you don't take your phone out. Like you sit with whoever you're with and enjoy the conversation and really connect. But now to even read the menu, like everyone has to, use the QR code and open the
yeah,
menu on your phone. So
yeah,
despite your best efforts, you're still sitting at this table with people that you really just want to connect with, and everyone's got their head down on their phone and there's no other option. So I think it's going to take a lot of conscious effort for us to back ourselves out of this corner, this reliance on phones and apps to get through our daily life, and to bring that all back down to discrimination. You look at our geriatric population and they're trying to do anything, get their vaccination, and people are
yeah,
like, oh, so just get the app, upload your vaccination card. And it's like, this person doesn't own a smartphone.
yeah.
Um, and certainly as we all age, sure, we're going to grown up in the era of always having these types of things. And so it's normal, but it's very difficult if you tried to go through a, you know, a, a day or a week in our world with no smartphone. Your opportunities to access help, information, very important basic needs is completely impaired. And how much does a smartphone cost? Like $1,000 now? I don't know. Plus a subscription to your Wi-Fi or 3G. And then, so yeah, it's a problem.
The last thing I'll say, because I think this is actually a really good conversation to have. The last thing I'll say, just from my perspective, is uh, there's this expectation now that you have to respond to things on social media and via text within like some crazy time span, like 2 to 6 hours. And I'm just like, that's not right. Like I get penalized
No,
if I don't respond to a text in like 3 hours, or an email in like 12 hours. And it's just like, how do you get work done if you have that expectation? How do you get any quality
I
work
know.
done? So anyways, I appreciated that thread. Two more questions.
Sorry, took it
No,
way
it's good.
sideways.
No, I think it's an issue affecting runners just as much as anybody. And that's what's cool about running is you can escape. Last two questions here. I've really enjoyed this conversation. What is a recent book, movie, or podcast you've consumed that has had a pretty big impact on you, like changed the way you think or see the world, and why?
So I can think of two books that I've read. One maybe changed the way I think, and the other completely reinforced the way I think. Um, so, I'm not sure if but tragically in Canada, a major issue on all of our minds has been the residential schools, that in the last year, we continue to find unmarked graves at residential schools where a lot of the at the time were called Indians, but the Indian residential school was forced upon a lot of our Indigenous population. And in 2020, a Canadian writer wrote Five Little Indians. The author is Michelle Good, and she's Cree Canadian, and it's a very short read. I'm not going to say, I mean, it's an easy read in terms of the text, but you should be prepared to like be crying. But it follows five Indians in their life after boarding school. And I would recommend everyone read that. I think, I mean, it probably reaffirmed some of the things that we've been hearing about, but was just a reminder of how horrific it was, and how it can, going through that, impacts not just that generation, but generations to come. So that's an excellent book. I would recommend, obviously, every Canadian read, but probably even people from any other country. And then another book that was just handed to me at Christmas, one of my family members found it in one of those fantastic libraries that, you know, you're walking along the street and there's like a little wooden door with a bunch of books in it. And it was Where the Crawdads Sing, which is actually set in North Carolina, somewhere I've never been in my life. But there's a young girl who's kind of abandoned by her family, and she lives in a marsh, and her proximity to nature and living with it and studying it and becoming just a student of the land around her and the animals, and I absolutely loved the book, and it made me realize that female biologist main characters are one of my favorite books to read. Apparently, I was actually talking to Claire about this during the first half of Black Canyons, because I think she's going back to school for her marine biology kind of career, but I would also highly recommend that book.
Very cool. Last question. If you could put a message on a billboard for all to see, what would it say and why?
No, this one's hard. Maybe find nature, which is not necessarily, we've talked about, that's easier for some than others. And depending on your background, that might not be easy. But I think as trail runners, we ideally move through nature a lot. But I think if we get too serious about it, you know, you could be about your pace time or the workout that you're doing on this hill and sort of fail to really soak up the amazing place that you're in. So, I mean, I won't lie. Sometimes I'm out in nature and I'm doing something very purposeful and a bit more focused on like my physical effort. But most of the time, I'm trying to just really appreciate where I am and feel grateful for the fact I can be on this single track or this mountainside or crossing this river or just like under these beautiful trees. And I think you get this sense of calm and gratitude when you really just let yourself just be in nature and realize how beautiful it is.
That's awesome. And before we exit here, to bring back in the urban planning discussion, there's a really cool Twitter account I follow that shows these photos of nature in like record time, taking back over these human engineered built environments. Nice. And so we do have hope that if we decide to change as a society, that we can bring nature back to like New York City and San Francisco and all these major metro areas.
Yeah. Or hope, you know, I've heard people say that no matter what, nature is going to, we might be gone, but
yes,
but she'll survive.
Well, hey, it's been great to meet. I've loved every element of this conversation. For folks that want to follow your journey to Western States, whether it's over social media or Strava, Instagram, what's the best way to get in touch to follow?
Yeah, so I try to limit myself to Instagram. I think it's am.madden, Madden, is the handle. Sure. While I do use Strava, I don't actually like post publicly to it at the moment. That one's a internal debate. I'm not sure if I've considered whether I should open it up on my lead up to Western States or not, but I kind of just enjoy being able to do my own thing without feeling like I have to worry about what anyone else is, you know, thinking about my time outside. But I don't know. I don't know what I'll do there, but definitely Instagram would be the one.
Well,
And for the record, this is another tangent I'm going to go on. Sorry if we're going over time.
Go ahead.
I'm pretty sure, like, just literally because of the cap of time I have from work, I would not say I'm a high volume trainer. And I think Claire often describes herself as not being a huge volume athlete either. So people out there don't have to feel that the only way to get a golden ticket or run ultra marathons is by running 100 plus miles a week. You can with less.
Amen. As someone who also exists in that camp, I strongly second or third that. That's awesome. Well, hey, this has been great. Hopefully we can have you on again at some point in the future, because I've really enjoyed this conversation and felt like we could have had a ton more threads to go down. So thank you.
Winding roads. Thank you. Thanks for reaching out.